The promise is genuinely appealing. Free healthcare, free education, an end to poverty. An economy run not for profit, but for people, where the basic necessities of life are guaranteed to everyone, and where the obscene concentration of wealth at the top is broken up and distributed fairly. Where no one goes hungry because a corporation decided it was more profitable to let them. That is a compelling vision. The people who have believed in it were not stupid. Many of them were among the most educated and idealistic people of their generations. But here is the problem. And this is not a political problem. This is a mathematical one. In 1920, an Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises published a paper that identified what he called the economic calculation problem. His argument was precise and devastating. In an economy without market prices, the people running it have no mechanism to determine whether any given production decision is efficient or wasteful. They are, in his phrase, flying blind. Mises was not making a political argument. He was making a mathematical one. And the 20th century ran the experiment at scale. In Russia, in China, in Eastern Europe, in Cuba, in Venezuela, to test whether he was right. He was right every time. And understanding why is the most important economics lesson that the last 100 years of history has to offer. Thank you for being here. It genuinely means something. Welcome to Hidden Ledger, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Subscribe now and turn on notifications if this is the kind of thinking you've been looking for. And drop a comment with your city. This channel reaches people across dozens of countries, and I want to see the map. Start with the mathematics, because that is where the argument lives. An economy, even a relatively simple one, involves an almost incomprehensible number of individual decisions made simultaneously. What to produce, how much of it, what inputs to use, which production method is most efficient, how to transport the output, where to store it, how to allocate it among competing needs. In a market economy, prices solve this problem. Not perfectly, not without friction, but they solve it in a way that no alternative has ever replicated. When steel becomes scarce, its price rises. Rising prices signal to producers that more steel is needed. They signal to consumers to economize on steel use or find substitutes. They signal to investors that building more steel capacity is profitable. All of this happens automatically, through the price mechanism, without any central authority needing to be informed, to deliberate, or to issue instructions. The price is not just a number. It is a compressed signal that aggregates an enormous amount of distributed information. Every producer's costs, every consumer's preferences, every investor's assessment of future demand, into a single, instantly communicable piece of data. Friedrich Hayek, who built on Mises' work, called prices a distributed computational mechanism. No single mind, no committee, no computer can gather and process the local, tacit, constantly changing knowledge that prices automatically encode. The economic calculation problem is this. In the absence of prices set by voluntary exchange between buyers and sellers, how does a central planner know what to produce, in what quantities, using what methods? Mises' answer in 1920 was, they cannot. Not because they are not intelligent enough, not because they do not have the right intentions, but because the information that prices carry is not available in any other form. It cannot be surveyed, reported, or computed. It exists only in the decentralized actions of millions of people making decisions in their own specific circumstances. This is the fatal flaw. And it is mathematical, not moral. The Soviet Union ran the largest experiment in central economic planning in human history. The scale of what it attempted was, in its own way, remarkable. Gosplan, the state planning committee, employed millions of people across the Soviet economy to gather data, set production targets, and coordinate the allocation of resources across what was, at its peak, the second largest economy in the world. It used the most sophisticated computational tools available at the time. It had the coercive power of the state behind every instruction it issued. And it consistently produced outcomes that no market economy, however dysfunctional, could replicate. Massive surpluses of goods no one wanted alongside chronic shortages of goods everyone needed. Warehouses full of the wrong products while people stood in line for bread. Factories producing output that the statistics required them to produce and that no consumer had any use for. The reason was precisely what Mises had predicted. Without prices, planners had no feedback mechanism. Profit and loss, the signals that tell a market economy what is working and what is not, do not exist in a centrally planned system. A Soviet factory manager who produced goods no one wanted faced no financial penalty for doing so. A factory that used twice as much steel as necessary to produce a given output had no mechanism to discover that fact. The information that prices carry was simply absent. The Soviet Union's economy grew during its early decades, primarily through the application of massive quantities of labor and capital to industrial production in sectors where the planning problem was relatively simple: building steel mills, mining coal, producing tractors. But as the economy grew more complex, the calculation problem became progressively more acute. The number of goods, processes, and interactions that planners needed to coordinate grew faster than any administrative system could manage. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was consuming more resources than it was creating in value. The system was not simply inefficient. It was running backwards, using more than it produced, sustained only by oil revenues and foreign borrowing. When oil prices fell in the mid-1980s, the financial support structure that had been masking the system's fundamental dysfunction collapsed. The rest followed. The Chinese case is, if anything, more instructive, because it provides both the negative example and the positive one in a single country across a single generation. Between 1958 and 1962, Mao Zedong implemented the Great Leap Forward, a program of forced collectivization and centrally directed industrial production intended to rapidly transform China into a modern economic power. Local officials were given production targets for grain and steel. They were incentivized to report success and penalized for reporting failure. The result was one of the deadliest famines in recorded human history. Estimates of the death toll ranged from 15 million to 55 million people. Grain was being exported to demonstrate socialist success to the outside world, while rural populations were starving. Local officials falsified harvest reports to meet their targets. The central planners, receiving false data and having no price signals to correct against, continued issuing instructions that had no connection to agricultural reality. This is the calculation problem at its most catastrophic. Not bad intentions, not insufficient data collection, but the structural impossibility of replacing the distributed information system of the market with a centralized administrative one. Now compare that to what happened after 1978, when Deng Xiaoping began gradually reintroducing market mechanisms into the Chinese economy. Farmers were allowed to sell surplus production at market prices. Prices, not quotas, began to coordinate agricultural decisions. The results were immediate and dramatic. Agricultural output increased substantially within a few years. The reforms expanded into industry. Foreign investment was permitted in special economic zones. Over the following 4 decades, China moved approximately 800 million people out of poverty, the largest poverty reduction in human history achieved in a single lifetime. The people did not change. The culture did not change. The natural resources did not change. What changed was the institutional structure through which economic decisions were made, from central planning to market coordination. The outcome difference between the two systems in the same country is the controlled experiment that economic history rarely provides so cleanly. The same experiment ran in Germany and Korea. In 1945, Germany was divided along a line that ran through the middle of a single nation, a single culture, a single language, a single history. West Germany adopted market institutions. East Germany adopted central planning under Soviet direction. By 1989, when the wall came down and the two economies could be directly compared for the first time in 40 years, the divergence was so large that it required a massive transfer program, estimated at over 1.5 trillion euros, simply to begin integrating the East German economy into the West German one. The same people, the same language, the same culture, the same starting point. 40 years of different institutional structures produced outcomes that looked like different civilizations. The Korean Peninsula provides an even cleaner comparison, because the divergence has continued for 70 years without interruption. South Korea, which in the 1950s had a lower per capita income than several sub-Saharan African countries, is today one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced economies in the world. North Korea, under centralized planning, has experienced periodic famine and produced an economy that, by satellite photographs of nighttime light emission, is almost entirely dark. The same peninsula, the same ethnic population, the same resources, different economic systems. The difference in outcomes is not marginal. It is generational. 2 objections come up consistently. Both deserve honest answers. The first is computers. If the calculation problem is about information processing, why can't sufficiently powerful computers, or artificial intelligence, simply replace the price mechanism? Why can't a sufficiently sophisticated algorithm gather all the relevant data and produce optimal allocation decisions? The answer is that the calculation problem is not a data storage or processing problem. It is an epistemological one. The information that prices carry, the preferences, the local knowledge, the assessments of future value, the tacit understanding that a particular farmer has about this specific field in this specific year, is not recorded anywhere in a form that can be uploaded to a database. It exists only in the decisions that people make in their own circumstances. The moment a person acts in a market, their private knowledge becomes visible in a price. Before that moment, it is inaccessible to any outside observer, no matter how sophisticated. A computer can process whatever data it receives. But it cannot access the data that only exists in the decentralized actions of billions of people responding to their own specific circumstances. That is not a hardware limitation. It is a fundamental feature of how information about human preferences and resource availability actually exists in the world. The second objection is democratic socialism. The argument that central planning fails only when it is imposed coercively, and that a democratically managed economy would solve the information problem through participation and consent. But the calculation problem does not depend on the political legitimacy of the planning authority. It depends on whether market prices exist. A democratically elected committee deciding production targets faces exactly the same information deficit as an authoritarian one. Democracy is a mechanism for choosing leaders and holding them accountable. It is not a mechanism for generating the distributed price signals that coordinate economic activity. The two questions are separate, and answering the first does not resolve the second. Venezuela is the most recent and most complete demonstration of this dynamic, and it is useful precisely because it was not a poor country when the experiment began. Venezuela, in the late 1990s, had the largest proven oil reserves in the world. It had a functioning middle class, established institutions, and an economy that had generated significant wealth. It was not a starting-from-scratch experiment. It was a country with substantial existing wealth choosing to reorganize its economy around central planning and price controls. The results followed the Mises prediction with almost textbook precision. Price controls on food, intended to make basic goods affordable, removed the profit signal that tells farmers and distributors to produce and stock those goods. Shortages followed. The government expanded the controls and nationalized industries to address the shortages. Nationalized industries, freed from the profit and loss feedback mechanism, became inefficient and underproductive. The currency was printed to cover the deficits. Inflation accelerated. By the late 2010s, Venezuela was experiencing hyperinflation of several million % per year, a country with the world's largest oil reserves, unable to feed its own population. This was not caused by American sanctions, which came after the economic collapse was already well advanced. It was not caused by falling oil prices alone, which affected neighboring countries without producing comparable results. It was caused by the systematic removal of the price mechanisms through which an economy coordinates the production and distribution of goods, and the replacement of those mechanisms with central planning that had no way to access the information prices carry. Market economies are not perfect. They produce inequality. They produce cycles of boom and recession. They generate outcomes that are often unfair and that do not always reflect people's contributions or needs. These are genuine criticisms, and they deserve genuine responses. But the question of whether market economies are perfect is different from the question of whether centrally planned economies can generate wealth. The historical record on the second question is not ambiguous. Every large-scale experiment in central economic planning has produced the same outcome. Initial growth, where the planning problem is simple, increasing dysfunction as complexity grows, and eventual failure as the information deficit at the heart of the system becomes impossible to manage. The wealth that alleviates poverty, that funds healthcare systems, that produces the technologies that extend and improve human life, that wealth is generated by market economies. Not because markets are morally superior, but because markets have access to the distributed information that prices carry, and central planning does not. Mises identified this problem in 1920. The 20th century ran the experiment. The evidence came back. Understanding why centrally planned economies fail is not a political position. It is a reading of the historical record. History does not punish people for having good intentions. It punishes people for ignoring what the evidence shows. Here's the comment I want to leave you with. Is the failure of centrally planned economies a fundamental mathematical problem, as Mises argued, or is it primarily an implementation failure that a better designed system could solve? Drop your answer below. And if this kind of analytical economic history is what you're looking for, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.